Hi, my name's Phil Craig. I'm a writer, a TV producer, a lover of stories, and a connoisseur of scandal. And I'm on a mission to bring you the most scandalous tales ever told. So thanks for joining me here at the Scandal Mongers podcast. Happy New Year. Welcome back. Here I am, back at the bar, back with the podcast. Had a nice break. It's been so lovely here. And thank you to so many of you who sent lovely messages about our Christmas. I think if you've seen the last couple of episodes, you'll know there's been a certain amount of family drama in the Craig household and the associated mother-in-law household, Jennifer, around the corner. And she was basically bedbound when I last spoke to you, but she's been pottering around, more than pottering around, actually, real improvements. She couldn't come here for Christmas, but she was able to come for New Year's Eve. Got her in a wheelchair, wheeled around the corner, and since then she's been out and about. We took her to a restaurant 2 nights ago for the first time, and she's managing stairs with a bit of help. So real progress. And it's been quite lovely. Our kids have really rallied around, and lots of people have come to see her. So it's been lovely, actually. And thank you to all of you who sent best wishes both to us and to her. I read them all to her, and they really helped lift her mood. Didn't help her find any time to watch the podcast, however, but she will when she's back up on her feet. So back to normal. Me, the bar, the podcast, and oh yes, what's on the bar today, Phil? Well, since you've asked, you can help me with pronunciation. A rather fine Islay malt whiskey. I think it's Bunnahabhain, but I don't know. What do you think? Bunnahabhain? Bunnahabhain? Welsh, Scottish Gaelic, I'm guessing. Anyway, lovely whiskey for Burns Night, which is coming up soon, and it's something we always do here. There we are. Here's the bottle. There we are. Other malt whiskies are available. I'm not being sponsored, sadly, by this manufacturer. Although if you want to sponsor me, get in touch. So Burns Night, we always do it here, and with a bit of luck, we'll get Jennifer around and some of our friends and family. And actually, now I think of it, a couple of years ago, I did a ode. You know, you read the poem, the ode to the haggis. You address the haggis before you chop it up, and we share it around. But I've done it probably more than most in the family. But one year, I did an ode to a vegan haggis. It's about 4 or 5 years ago, which was based on a poem somebody else had written, although I amended it and made it rather topical. And I thought it was quite funny, even though I say so myself. Anyway, I might put it in the bio if anybody wants to laugh. Or say, Phil, stop sharing your bad poetry. But yeah, Burns Night's coming. We've got the whiskey. The clouds are lifting over the sick bed around the corner. Things are looking rosy again. Actually, talking of rosy, now there's a good link. Rosie 2020 was one of the many people who sent lovely comments about the last programme. Oh, here I am again, not mentioning this show. Sorry. I'll get to a proper intro in a minute, but if you don't know, and you should, we're doing Harry versus Murdoch, and we're talking to Clive Irving again, and that's quite a coup. Clive is a very busy and rather important man, and he's found half an hour yesterday to talk to me about this coming showdown, and it is going to be one of the stories of the year, I think. So you're going to get a sneak peek from a real insider as to what's going on and what might happen next, and what it all means, too, in the context of Murdoch's life, and of course Harry's life, and his relationship with his family, which has been, as you all know, somewhat troubled of late. Yeah, Rosie 2020, one of many people who wrote lovely messages to the show I did before I had my little break, which was, I think, just after Christmas, wasn't it? We did the show with Helen Fry. Wow, says Rosie. Absolutely superb. Well, I love reading things like this. Helen's passion and dedication to recording this monumental piece of history is inspiring. Move over, Ben McIntyre. You've got a most worthy contender for the title of greatest war historian. Isn't that lovely? Well, Rosie, I'm glad you enjoyed it. And like many people, I think Rosie's probably rushed out to buy Helen's books. Lots of people said they were going to buy the books, which will no doubt please Helen. As for the title of greatest war historian, well, I hope I might make a little entry into that competition myself in April when my book's published. And be assured, I'll be talking about that a lot. Rebecca Day, 8612. I think you've been on here before, Rebecca. Anyway, thanks for sticking with us. Happy Christmas and Happy New Year. Got lots of messages like this. Says Rebecca, to you and to your family, I hope you enjoy your break. I'm looking forward to a 2025 rich with scandal. So am I. Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. And final comment from our old friend Swati Singh. Swati, who won the mug a few months ago. She was just a lovely comment, as many of you did. Thank you for all the stories and sharing them with us. Looking forward to more. Wishing you well. Wishing that your voice gets better. Yes, it has got better because I had a bit of a throat infection, just to pile more misery onto the family. Hope your throat gets better. Sending lots of healing energy to you and to your mother-in-law. So glad she's surrounded by family. At this time, I'm off to make a cup of tea while my latest cake bakes in the oven. Doesn't that sound idyllic? And the mug, the Scandal Mongers mug, is getting a great workout over the holiday break. That's so nice. Well, I had a bit of a workout over the break. Some of you may have noticed I popped up as a guest with Shauna Kay at the Vintage Read. In fact, Shauna's created a little sub-channel that she and I share, which we somewhat grandly call Unspinning the World. And you should check it out. We sort of put the world to rights, talk about big stories, and try to bring a certain amount of distance and judgment and fairness and balance to the things that people are arguing about at the moment. And actually, we've talked a bit about this. We're also going to expand the idea into more historical mysteries and conspiracies. So Shauna and I will be doing more shows in the next few months. We're not sure how often, but quite often, because I think we really enjoy it. And so far, so good. They're getting a good audience. And some of them might be you. But if you haven't checked it out, do check it out. And talking of audience, what really made my Christmas was I finally reached 10,000 subscribers. Yay! Should open the malt whiskey now to celebrate, except I can't because it's 9:30 in the morning and I'm not that desperate. But no, it was brilliant. I've been pestering for months. I seemed agonizingly close. Anyway, I now have 10,026, I think it is, subscribers. And I'm really grateful. If you're new here, you made a 64-year-old man very happy over Christmas. And it's great news. I don't quite know why it's a big deal, but it is a big deal. I even got a message from YouTube congratulating me. And I think what it means is the shows going forward will get more prominence. So maybe more people will find them. And then the whole thing can become a kind of virtuous circle. And we'll just build and build and build until we're dominating the global airwaves. Anyway, that's the plan. What else to talk about? I mentioned Shauna. I've mentioned the family health report. Oh, right. Well, let's get to the business at hand. Yes, Harry and Murdoch. Now, I know, having got to 10,000, I'm probably going to lose subscribers because I know a lot of you have very strong feelings about Harry. And whenever we do, well, both me and Andrew and me by myself, whenever we talked about Harry, we got a lot of people just saying, no, he's awful. And, what he's done to his family is unforgivable. And him and Meghan are just, the gruesome twosome grifters and all this stuff. And I have said this before, I'm going to say it again. I am sympathetic to a lot of that. I thought that Netflix series was appalling. It was just an example, to my mind, of two rather narcissistic people who got into a family dispute. And I think some of that dispute was about big stuff and some of it was about very small personal grievances. And it had all blown up. And they tried to make it be about massive things that it was never about, like the history of slavery and why Britain is this racist hellhole and all sorts of things like that, which I just thought it was cheap. It doesn't reflect the country I live in, that Harry lives in or lived in. And I really didn't like the obvious spin and manipulation in that series. Having said that, and this goes back, if you've watched before, you'll know, to my work on Diana. One of the reasons that's driven Harry apart from his family is the legacy of Diana and the legacy of the phone hacking scandal and the behavior of the tabloid press, and especially the Murdoch press, and the former paper that was closed down, the News of the World, which was a very powerful newspaper. People were frightened of that paper. It was closed down about 10, 12 years ago now, when it was revealed that one of its journalists had been hacking a dead girl's phone. And that just shocked people so much. And this was one of many. And then it all came out, and there've been lots of inquiries, and lots of people have sued, and I think over 1,000 people have settled. But Harry won't settle, and Clive Irving knows this story backwards. He's lived this story. Clive is one of the most prominent British newspaper figures of my lifetime. He created the famous Sunday Times Insight Team, perhaps the most impressive investigative journalistic organisation this country's ever seen. He ran some massive stories, and he was a managing editor of newspapers, plural. So he knows the world, and he encountered Murdoch, and he saw how Murdoch changed things, and he wasn't. Well, he'll explain himself. His views of Murdoch, I think, are nuanced, actually. But he really does. He's followed the story of these court cases, and he's made the point before that nobody has ever yet, as far as I know, or he knows, Nobody's ever yet got Rupert Murdoch into a court of law because they play it long, they have very expensive lawyers. Most people run out of patience or money, and then they're offered settlements that can be quite generous. I think Hugh Grant accepted one in this same case. And he said, look, I just can't keep going. And, I'm a pretty well-off movie star, but I just couldn't keep going. And they offered me quite a lot of money. So I considered it a moral victory and I walked away. But Harry isn't walking away because it's about a lot more than money to him. And that's where I do admire him. I'm sorry, I can feel the subscriber count is going down as I speak. What are you doing, Phil? You work so hard to get to 10,000. But that's it. I hope you'd expect me to be honest and fair when I can be, and to see both sides. Like I say, not a massive fan of Harry and Meghan and what they've done, and some of the things they've said. But the Murdoch story is big, and he is playing a rather important role in it. And I think that's probably enough from me. Thank you for rejoining me after the break. I'm looking forward to another great year together. I've got some nice, exciting news about upcoming guests to share with you at the end of Clive. Now, let's go all the way to Washington, find out what's going on with Murdoch. Thanks. Bye. Well, welcome, Clive, and thank you for joining us as a 1950s beatnik poet.
Well, that's your view of my role.
I was thinking more of your jumper, actually. You look like maybe a young Bob Dylan or something like that.
I like that even better.
Well, they're meant to be flattering. So, yes, well, thank you for joining me again at the Australian Bar, where one day I hope to see you perching in person. That would be nice.
Oh, thanks. Yes, it looks very inviting.
Well, it's a little early even for me, but yeah, well, thank you for joining us. I was prompted to ask you to return to the podcast by a great article you wrote, which you very kindly shared with me. And I'm just going to read the headline because I think it's a headline you might have rather enjoyed writing.
Yeah.
How Prince Harry planted a ticking time bomb under the Murdoch empire. I mean, there's a lot to unpack in that one headline, isn't there?
There is. Well, I think the overall point is that only someone like Harry, with his devotion to this thing and his resources, could have set up what looks like the most serious exposure of the whole structure inside the Murdoch empire that produced the hacking scandal in the first place. And then after the scandal was exposed, and they admit to all the hacking now, obviously, after the scandal was exposed, the measures that were taken to do two things: to try to cover up who was involved, and then to try to cover up the cover-up. That they tried to remove as much physical evidence of in the emails at Wapping at the Murdoch newspaper headquarters, the tabloid headquarters. So this is very much the culmination of it's gone on for so long, and 1,300 more than 1,300 people have settled their cases, and we're now down to the last two people. So it is it's the final shootout of the whole thing, and clearly the largest part of the drama, because the final two people are Prince Harry and Tom Watson, now Lord Watson. And as you may recall, Tom Watson was a very active deputy prime minister and a very active opponent of the Murdochs at the time all this came out, and was a very tough interrogator of Rupert and James Murdoch when they appeared before the Commons Committee. So Tom Watson had done everything he possibly could to make himself a personal target for the Murdoch empire. He was considered enemy of Murdoch's. So there you have these two people together, Harry and Watson, finally bringing it. The trial is due to open on, it was originally due to open on January the 20th. It now opens on January the 21st, possibly, I think, because they realized that it was colliding with the inauguration of Donald Trump.
So there's so much to talk about. Before we dive into the details of this particular case, I'd love to just talk a little, because a lot of people don't know, especially people who are a bit younger than us, just how very important and just how very powerful Murdoch has been for the last, 40, 50 years? And he's clearly well into his 90s. He ain't going to be around very much longer. This might be, this court case, the big moment when his legacy gets perhaps forever tarnished. Who knows? But before the case starts, how would you describe his function, his role, his impact on the world throughout this time? Big question.
He's a considerable figure. I mean, he's of all the world's media empires, and there are media empires larger than this, but of all the world's media empires, his is the most personalized, the one that's most identified with one person and that one person's mindset, if you like, that one person's views and that one person's style of working. So this he comes from a small. His father owned a small newspaper in Adelaide, Australia, a small group of papers, which his father built into an empire. And then in the 1960s, he moved to London. And the moving to London is the crucial turning point in the building of the empire, because first of all, he has to establish himself with a British presence and a British newspaper in a newspaper system which was archaic, really, which he recognized. It was owned by a lot of old peers, newspaper peers created by earlier governments. And it was like a cartel, an ownership cartel. They had very strict trade union rules about working practices. All this was agreed between the proprietors and the unions. And Murdoch looked at this and thought, this is not a viable situation for the future. So he's, I'll cut a long story short, he planned over a period of years to violate this whole settled procedure of Fleet Street, and he did by breaking the power of the unions by more or less doing an overnight flit from Gray's Inn Road to Wapping, setting up a complete union-free operation, and changed the price of entry for coming into newspapers. That's the essential thing he did. He lowered the price of entry, and that made it possible for a brief time for other people to start new newspapers, like the Independent began as a result of that. So here's the good side, the positive, creative side of Murdoch. And at the same time, he's a man with a world vision. He's not content with a British newspaper empire. So he wants to build a global empire, not just in newspapers, but obviously he spotted the possibilities of breaking away from state-owned television, when in the old days we had two channels, the BBC and ITV, and that was it. And then BBC Two came along, and that was three, and that was wonderful. But Murdoch saw us that he saw the future in which we could have as many TV channels as we like, and he went into satellite television broadcasting. So he was a visionary in that. He had been a visionary in newspapers. But who was he, and what was his mission in the end? What were his beliefs? The newspaper on which he built his British empire was a red-blooded, all-out tabloid, The Sun, which was his creation, and it was entering a market which was dominated by the long-standing British classic tabloid, the Daily Mirror, and in the end he overtook the Daily Mirror.
And the Daily Mirror had always been a left-wing paper, as people should know.
Yeah, and it was very closely allied with the Labour Party from top to bottom. But he produced a new kind of popular tabloid, which was not aligned with any particular party. It's sensational in its approach to news and scoop driven all the way, which is where we come into the hacking situation, because from about, not as far as I can see, from 1994, 5, 6, 7, as soon as you've got people moving around with these brick phones, these large brick phones, and phones became and there was a technique for intercepting voicemail, and private investigators pioneered the whole way in which hacking could be done. So hacking then is incorporated into the reporting practices of the News of the World, the other tabloid that he had, the Sunday tabloid. They discovered the delights of hacking into people's phones and industrialized it, did it on such a vast scale, and that emerged. And so now the second layer of why Rupert Murdoch is a global figure and why his own personal views are important is that he moves to America. He starts Fox News, and at the beginning, the idea of Fox News is just another channel, but not really politically connected in terms of being connected to the Republican or the Democratic Party, but just committed to a kind of populist feeling that it was good. It was like the voice of the tabloids being carried over into television, that blowing up everything was a good idea. And then they discover Fox News becomes a kind of catalyst for all the disgruntlement and unease and dissatisfaction of a broad mass of Americans who felt that they'd been excluded from the normal political processes. And This is a very complicated situation, which I'll try and simplify it. So Fox News establishes a base of people who feel that they have a grudge against the elites, the so-called bi-coastal elites. Murdoch latches onto this, realizes that it's the same phenomenon that made The Sun and the News of the World a success. A kind of that he creates an idiom in television in the same way he created an idiom in the tabloids, in that he creates a way of talking to this audience and capitalizing on its grudges. And as a result, Fox News becomes, more than anyone in the UK can possibly, who hasn't seen it, possibly appreciate, becomes a mouthpiece, a very driven mouthpiece for very extreme political views and conspiracy theories of all kinds. And of course, this then marries into the Trump phenomenon. As soon as Trump appears as a candidate for the presidency, he's really working over a base that's already been created by Fox News. And so you get this union between Murdoch and Trump, in that Trump's already a television phenomenon from The Apprentice, but the two operations are so similar in their intention and in their voice and in their way they address the people, that it becomes a marriage of the two things. And so that explains the huge power of
No, that's an extremely good upsum of why he matters. But I'm not interested. I think maybe more than I expected. I think there are parts of Murdoch you rather admire. The energy,
yeah,
the fact that he took on the unions, who really were antediluvial at that time, the fact that he opened up media to new players, at least temporarily, and the fact that he was a man with a vision. And let's be honest, other newspaper and media proprietors had always had political views, often quite openly pushing a particular agenda or a particular party. You mentioned the Mirror. What's wrong with somebody doing it? You don't have to buy his papers. You don't have to turn on Fox News. What's wrong with what he did, in your view?
Well, I was in a very interesting position in this, in that it became autobiographical for me, in that I didn't work on the Daily Mirror, but I worked for Hugh Cudlip, who was the creator of the Daily Mirror, because I was running the magazine division of the company at the time. And so I got to know Hugh Cudlip extremely well, and I got to see what was going on in the direct competition between the Mirror and the Sun as Murdoch created. And Cudlip could never understand Murdoch. He could never understand why Murdoch was able to break what he thought were the rules that you played by. And so even a committed Labour Party figure like Hugh Cudlip and his boss Cecil King, that's another story which we can do, they couldn't understand how it was that this, just sort of in upper class language, how could this bounder appear and break all the rules? And that's what I admired about, what I loved about Murdoch, because my whole background was in Fleet Street at the Daily Express, basically. And what I admired about Murdoch was he was a great newspaper man. He had newspapers in his blood, and I loved that side of him. I could see he was a very quick responder. That was another thing. And he was very adept at presenting, at the presentation and voicing of a newspaper, which people don't really understand is the most important thing about any newspaper. It is the voicing of it, the collective voicing of it. And he was very good at that. And so there's this whole positive side. And then there's this tremendous negative, which is all dragged down by his basic debasement of his whole life, really, his basic debasement of the underlying ethical probity of journalism. And he basically blew that up in London. And of course, tragically, in my views, when he took over the Sunday Times, he destroyed one of the greatest newspapers in the country, and if not in the world, by imposing his own will on it and completely preventing it from being the radical force and the great force in journalism that it had been. So,
how did you experience that personally, Clive?
Well, I didn't experience it personally because I'd already left the Sunday Times when he took it over. So, for background, I created the Insight investigative team at the Sunday Times in 1963, and then became managing editor of the paper, which meant that I ran the newsroom. And so the paper that I handed over to Harry Evans when Harry Evans arrives, because I left and he took over basically the role that I'd had, had set up, had collected a wonderful group of reporters, some of the best journalists in the country,
Yes,
actually.
they were. Yes, they were.
And so Harry then poured more resource. Harry realized the value of insight, and he poured more resources into it, hired more people, and carried out my philosophy of don't worry about deadlines, just go spend as much time on the story as you can. Collect, if it takes months, it takes months, and then come in with a big bang at the end of it. And that's what made the name of the paper. That was not, see, the problem with that idea and that philosophy, which affected Harry very much and offended me deeply, was that Murdoch didn't think that any journalist he employed should have that kind of independent power, that they should be able to decide which stories you did, who you attacked, and the depth of which you went into attack it, and that it was completely apolitical. It wasn't that on behalf of one party or another. It was on behalf of the public interest, and the way that a newspaper can represent in a powerful way the public interest, as Harry did with his exposure to the thalidomide scandal and the Philby spy scandal, and all that kind of stuff came out because of that. And see, when Harry moved to edit the Times as opposed to the Sunday Times, he was in direct line of collision with Murdoch because he represented that kind of editorial independence, which clearly Murdoch was not willing to tolerate. And so that whole tradition that I felt very involved in was basically wiped out at that point.
All right. Well, look, I think you and I could furiously agree about all of this, but that's rather boring for anybody watching and listening. So I'm going to take on a slightly more oppositional role. I'm going to pretend to be someone like Andrew Neil, another great editor of the Sunday Times, who would, if he was here, would not agree with a lot of what you just said. He'd probably say something like, "Oh, come on. You're just angry that your worldview was replaced by a different one. The Sunday Times was a great paper, still is a great paper. But the only thing that changed is that you lot didn't get to twist things your way."
Well, I'd like to have that argument with Andrew, and I know Andrew felt that way very much when he edited the paper, and the Sunday Times still does extremely good. The Insight team still exists, and it still does extremely good journalism. But that's not the point, really. There's a filter there, and whether Andrew admits it or not, there was a filter there then too. There was a limit to what he was free to do, this is not a grudge on my part or a grudge on posthumously on the part of Harry Evans. It's just a statement of the culture as it was. I mean, I had, and so did Harry, had a wonderful editor-in-chief called Dennis Hamilton, who basically said, do it. That was, and at no point would he have dreamt of saying, well, we have some company corporate interests here, which might be upset by this story. So I don't want that story to be done. And there are all these subtle pressures that Murdoch introduced that were not there before. So there is a clear space for investigative journalism to work. And, the interesting thing is that Murdoch owns the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal was saved by Rupert Murdoch because it was run by a family called the Bancrofts, who were basically running it into the ground because they run it as though it was a 1920s newspaper, not a paper for the 21st century. And Murdoch brought in some extremely good journalists. He has not only saved that paper, but he's left it alone to be the true core voice of the Republican Party before Trump, which is a hell of an achievement because the Republican Party itself is no longer that party. But the Wall Street Journal stands for the values of the conservative right wing in America in a way that the Republican Party no longer does. And that's been done under Murdoch. So this shows you the puzzle and the paradox of Rupert Murdoch. One side of the brain allows that to happen. The other side of the brain allows Fox News to happen. And they live in the same building. It's extraordinary that that contrast can exist under the same building.
No, this really does set the scene beautifully, and that's extremely good. And few people have seen this closer than you, and it's great that you can share all this with us. But let's go back to the court case then. So, as we know, as you say, standards collapsed. People were openly cutting corners, and I remember I was working at the BBC in the 90s. We often worked with and hung out with people who worked for the tabloids, numerous tabloids, and openly boasted about hacking phones. It was seen as like going through dustbins. It was just something that a really good hack did. And they were not particularly ashamed about it at all, even though it was illegal. Of course, all that came crashing down. Series of court cases, one by one. Murdoch and his happy band of lawyers pay them all off. And there's just really Harry standing. Now, Harry gets a lot of stick. I whenever I praise him, I get so much abuse. And not that I'm at it in the comments, I mean. He gets a lot of stick, and maybe he deserves some of it. But I do really admire what he's done with this case, and I think you do as well, don't you?
I do, and it wouldn't have happened without him. And I think that if you think that that the trial split into two parts, the first part will be Harry comes at the end. He probably won't be appearing until March. Because it's split into two parts, and it's important to understand the difference between the two parts. The first part is dealing with what's called generic issues, and that's a very fancy technical legal way of saying that this is where the pot spills over. They open up the whole thing. So it means that the evidence that will be introduced in the generic part of the trial is evidence that's not directly specifically related to the claims made by Harry and Watson. So those two are called the claimants. The first part, the generic part, is when over the last few years, and as recently as November and December, a great discovery operation has been going on where the lawyers have been taking witness statements from hundreds of people. There are 700 separate documents involved in this with 200,000 or more pages.
Wow.
Which will be distilled down. And what this will do in the end, what it's designed to do, and I think it can do, is describe the architecture that inside the offices that allowed this to happen, and why the Murdoch organization are so terrified of this. And this is the ticking bomb: is that does it reach up? How far does it? Does collusion, knowledge of it, and approval of it reach up into the system? So what they're doing is a very curious thing. Is they've invented a kind of cannon fodder in which they've offered up, the numbers are interesting, they've offered up 23 journalists, and all those journalists are low-level reporters, and the list stops at about newsroom editor level, and there's no one being offered above that. So all that. And there are 16 private investigators who are going to give evidence in this part too. So it's a shielding operation, and it's a shielding operation that lies behind the fact that they've settled 1,300 cases, because the main motive for settling those cases was not just to compensate the damage that was done to each of these 1,300 people, but it was to keep out of the public view the hands-on nature of the industrialized and institutionalized hacking and blagging, as blagging is an important part of this too. Blagging meaning that you go after documents and evidence of, you go for someone's medical records or stuff like that. Anything that and that's where the PI, the private investigators come in, because they were doing all the blagging as well. And another point I'd like to make about Harry is that his first cases start in 1 year after the death of his mother. They start in 1998. He's 13 years old, and that's the first case, and it goes up to I think 2010. His cases altogether. So in a sense, he's providing a portrait of what it felt like to experience that. And if you look at I reread Harry's book, and if you look at that period of his life, he was under enormous, terrible tension, and he was trying to get his mother's presence out of his head, and yet he was trying to recover it too. So this enormous conflict, and he was, like a 13-year-old kid who had lost his mother and was very driven by the way that his mother had been tortured by this same system, and so that was in his head. He had all sorts of things he was wrestling with, and William was very helpful, being the elder brother to a certain extent, but Harry was different. I think Harry was more sensitive and more aware of this. And I feel that even now, when you look at what he's doing, Diana is still very much alive in his mind as he's doing
well, we've talked about this before, and I think I still find it extraordinary. And I don't think even now people quite understand what really happened. People who worked directly for the future King of England, our now king, who was going to be, and now is, the head of the Church of England, a man who should command massive respect. People who worked directly for him were like that, with just the worst of these tabloid papers and my people that ran them, on holidays with them, chatting with them, drinking with them, going out with them, doing deals with them. And this, I think, is what really broke William and Harry apart, because William was prepared to buy into that system. And maybe that's the pragmatic approach, but Harry wasn't, for all sorts of reasons, and you mentioned some of them. As he saw, I think not only himself but his mother's memory was a casualty of this collusion between the royal household and the lowest of the tabloids. So now I'm getting even more left wing and angry than you. But I do feel quite, and that isn't me normally, but I do feel quite strongly that people never quite got the enormity of this.
Well, that's still the thing.
Still blows my mind.
They're still briefing against him now. This is the extraordinary thing. There are people in the palace who still brief against Harry now.
Yeah, well, at least they're not going on holiday with the editor of the News of the World and all that
I mean,
stuff.
come on. Andrew is a far worse problem and embarrassment than Harry will ever be to the royal family. Harry's not a problem to the royal family at all now. He's just a wasted asset, an asset they could have used and don't use. Whereas Andrew is a continual embarrassment.
Well, he is. You're quite right. All right, so role play me this. There will come a moment when somebody important has to come before this court. What do you think is going to happen then? Do you have a view, or do you think even now it might all collapse?
I don't have a view, because I don't understand exactly the degree of exposure and how hard it will be to defend this case. I mean, the fact that they've settled all these cases show they are very fully aware of the damage, the reputational damage it will do, not just to Murdoch, but to Rebecca Brooks, the editorial czar through much of this period, and then the people who were involved, like the CEO and publisher of the Washington Post, the people involved in what happened afterwards when all these emails disappeared. That's a very live issue. They were still taking evidence about the deletion of the emails on November the 24th of last year. So there's a very late witness statement about that. So I think it's going to be electrifying, because it will be a way of laying out for people who have no idea just exactly how menacing this whole system was and how much harm it did.
Interesting. And in terms of Murdoch's legacy, I mean, we've said he's a love-hate figure. He is a man.
Yeah.
It's easy to admire lots of things about him, but it's also easy to feel that he took the whole system and the companies he controlled down some very dark paths. His legacy, do you think, could be tarnished by what happens in court?
There's no doubt about that, although I don't think it could be any more tarnished than it already is in a way. I mean, Fox News has done much more damage to his legacy than the hacking scandal. If you live in America and you see the effect of Fox News on the democratic process and all the damage it's done to in conspiracy theories and in fake news and in warping all the so-called reporting. There's no real straight reporting going on at all. So that is in the scale of its damage to the democratic system of the United States, it's far more grievous charge against Murdoch than even the hacking, which is important.
You said earlier, though, that Fox News gave a voice to people who had been pretty much ignored by these so-called coastal elites, and that there is some truth in that, and there's also some truth in people who say the other networks aren't exactly fair-minded. Look what happened when Trump was elected the first time. The MSNBC was like 24/7, just theory, Russia's this, Russian that, and actually a lot of that turned out to be not very much. So I don't know.
I think that's a direct result of Fox News in a way. I agree with everything you say about MSNBC being partisan and boringly partisan. I mean, slavishly partisan, to the point where when it was obvious that Biden shouldn't run for a second term, they slavishly followed his view. And then when finally he quit, they said, "Oh, this is great," and that was a disaster.
Yeah,
so,
it was.
yeah, so I agree with you there. I mean, I think that CNN is the only one that keeps a kind of, I think, straight arrow line down the centre and allows views on both sides in a very balanced way.
So will you be do you planning to come to the trial, or are you going to have somebody from your magazine there sending you kind of texts every 5 minutes?
I think Vanity Fair will be covering this very well. that have eyes, and it will have eyes and ears above ground and below ground.
It is going to be one of those moments, isn't it? One of those massive courtroom set pieces where,
Oh, absolutely. But it's also, it's not just theatre though. It's really culturally important, because you've got a member of the royal family doing this. That's extraordinary when you think about it. The great crusader,
Well, yes, we talked a lot about, Murdoch's legacy and the ticking time bomb that's possibly underneath it. Do you think Harry's legacy and popularity could be affected by what's about to take place? Because, as I say, it's not just my comment section. I think generally in Britain, anyway, he's now really very unpopular. And maybe there are lots of reasons for that. I thought some of the things in that Netflix series were awful. But, maybe this could be a way for him to kind of win back some affection, maybe even begin the journey to reconcile with his brother. Or maybe I'm being Pollyanna.
I mean, look, he's a flawed figure, but the flaws aren't serious. They're trivial, and a little touch of Harry in the night. This is, it's going to be it's going to be a great credit to him to have had the balls to do this and stick it out and do it.
That's a very good way of putting it, and I do agree with you. And that's the part of Harry that I like, the slightly cussed part.
I think it's a Spencer, and it's the Spencer part of Winston Spencer Churchill. There's a kind of echo there that there's the old contrary.
Yes, and it is interesting that the Spencers are continually sending signals that they kind of still support Harry in all of this.
So they should. But, he's a contrarian. You like contrarians. I like contrarians.
Yeah.
That's what he is. And God knows that's better than all the slavish conformity of the royal family.
Yeah. And the Murdoch system, it kind of has collapsed anyway, slightly under the weight of its own contradictions and the rise of social media.
Yeah.
But it was something pretty awful. And I've known people, and I bet you do, who were turned over or threatened by. And we know this about you, and somebody, so-and-so is having an affair. We found out all about it. And if you run this program, this is going to get aired. There was leverage applied to people by this.
Even Alan Rusbridger, who was the editor of The Guardian, who ran the original exposure of the whole thing, they said he had a love child. They charged him with having had a love child. And that was Rebecca Brooks saying that. There was no love child. They were entirely unscrupulous. And the one thing that you see about all these people is their lack of acquaintance with the idea of scruples.
No, I do agree with that. And of course, I'm going back in time now, but you'll remember the way that when the Sun was in its pomp and it was selling 5 or 6 million copies a day, and Kelvin Mackenzie, who was a brilliant editor of that kind of paper, was absolutely the voice of the kind of the young British right and the Maggie Thatcher voters. And when he came to that Hillsborough, I was covering that for Granada TV in Liverpool. And I'm filming people burning the Sun because they just printed the most appalling stuff. I mean, that legacy lingers. You still can't buy the Sun in most of Liverpool,
Really?
People, you see people tweeting, "Oh, I saw it on sale," and we went in and we had a word. No, because that was a shocking story, which one day I'd love to do a whole program on. But anyway, thank you. That's great. Half an hour of great analysis, setting the scene. I feel like I have a ringside seat at this trial of the century.
It's going to be a big drama. And it'll one more final comment about Rupert Murdoch, who poses as the friend of the popular people, is that he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth.
Yes, he was, wasn't he? He was not a self-made man.
No.
At all. And actually, we've not mentioned Australia because we all talk about Britain and America, but he's still hugely influential there. I think he's got a bigger percentage of media in Australia than anywhere else in the world. I mean, like 60% of the newspapers, or maybe more, are still owned by him. So he has a big say.
And a climate denier, as Australia burns and the climate wrecks the world, right?
Yeah, well, that's something else that Fox News was very, very strong on, wasn't it? Questioning climate change from the word go. Anyway, that's a story for another time. I've taken enough of your time, and thank you for joining me. I'm very excited by this trial, and we might have to get you back to analyse the winners and the losers in a couple of months.
Great to talk to you, Phil. Bye.
You too, mate. Thanks ever so much. Love the polo egg. Bye.
Bye.
Well, there you go. What can I say about my attempt to do a Scottish accent? I think I was probably influenced by the thoughts of Burns Night. And in the unlikely event of Andrew Neil actually watching the podcast, I'm sure he'll let me know what he thinks. Andrew Neil, some of you will know, is a rather distinguished commentator, another former editor of the Sunday Times. Probably doesn't see the world in quite the same way that Clive Irving does. But is quite a big player. I think in the end he fell out with Murdoch too, but he's probably a little bit more politically aligned with Murdoch's view of the world than Clive. Anyway, so much for the Scottish accent. Although the one on the ode to the vegan haggis is a lot better than what I just did with Clive. I promise you. Yes, haggisers, journalists. And the future's bright, and we have got some great guests coming, and I'm really excited. Get back in the swing of it, doing a show every week. Writer James Crossland joined me recently. We did a great conversation. He's written a book called Rogue Agent. This is everything that I like. Conspiracy, politics, misdeeds in high places, sexual scandal, and lots and lots of alcohol. This guy, he wrote a book about Bruce Lockhart and his life, which most important part of his life is during revolutionary Russia, where he's like a British agent and he gets involved with all sorts of intrigues in St. Petersburg and Moscow at that time, and he's looking to escape with his life. And the famous TV series, some of you may remember, and book Ace of Spies, is sort of about all that. Anyway, it's a wonderfully colourful story, and James tells it really well. Talking of people who tell stories well, Carolyn Harris, our Canadian consort connoisseur. Yeah, alliteration is everything. So Canadian consort connoisseur Carolyn Harris, who was such a hit with you all when she was on the show about 2 or 3 months ago. She's back. I sat down with her on Zoom and we talked about Marie Antoinette for nearly an hour. And it was hard for me to get a word in edgeways. She's an absolute fount of knowledge and she shares it so very well. I think if you've got any interest in the French Revolution or the scandalous world of the Bourbons and the life of the court and the intrigues, or just like a really good yarn, Caroline is great fun. And I'm so glad she's now a friend of the show. Somebody I've got to know through writing my book. My book kind of touches on all sorts of themes to do with colonialism and the empire, the British Empire, and all empires, is a man called Alan Lester. He's a professor of history, and he's joining me in a couple of days to talk about the Opium Wars, which is such an amazing story. I met with him and we sat down and I had no idea. I think we talk a lot about slavery and, whether or not that should be, the fact that the British state at the time took the slave trade to a new level, and a lot of people made a lot of money. But of course, the British state also abolished slavery long before most other places. So where does that stand in the sort of pros and cons of British history? So it's a very lively subject, and people get very agitated, and Alan takes part in that conversation. But he was saying that in a way, there's a bigger story that we don't really know about, the sort of dark side of empire, and that's the opium trade. And it's so interesting. And I thought I knew a little bit about it. I know nothing about it. He knows loads. That's a great story for lovers of history. So Alan will be on. Mock O'Keefe, who was with us a couple of weeks ago as a kind of joint shared hosting deal. Mock's coming back probably in February. Not quite sure what we're going to talk about. Actually, the conversation we had with Mock, all about Lord Byron and the sort of birth of the Gothic literature and the Gothic imagination. I think that's the most successful show I've done for months in terms of an audience. It really brought in perhaps a lot of people who are interested in the Gothic, or maybe they're just people that Mock's got a big following on Instagram and elsewhere. So if you're one of Mock's mates and you've stayed, thank you. I hope you'll enjoy seeing him back, and I'm sure I will, because he's always great fun. Loads more things that I'm talking to people about, loads more guests, some old, some new. But I think this is a really good start to the 2025. Hope you enjoyed listening to Clive. And whether you like Harry or you don't, please stick with me. I think I might avoid that subject altogether for a while. In fact, I definitely will. But anyway, thank you very much for your company once again. Please keep liking, please keep commenting, please keep subscribing if you can. And if you're listening on audio, you can always pop over to YouTube and do me a favor by subscribing on there. It is totally free. And that's the one that matters in terms of I guess in terms of the prominence of the podcast, not just on YouTube, but across the whole kind of world of Google. Anyway, I don't really understand how it works. But anyway, if you're listening, if you're watching, thanks for your company. I'll see you again soon. Bye. This has been a Podcast World production. If you want to contact me, write to team@podcastworld.org, placing Scandalmongers in the heading, or you can reach out via the social media links in the show's bio. And if you've enjoyed this episode and you want to support the show, please consider taking a few seconds to hit the donate button found just below this video. Many thanks, and see you next week.